Hello and welcome back to my channel. Just a quick warning before we get into the video. This book does contain sexual assault, so if you're not comfortable hearing about that, I recommend that you just don't watch this video. So if you're still watching, I assume that you're on board for that, so let's get into it. So last time, we talked about a very good book that has had a profound impact on my brain. This time we're going to talk about a not-so-good book that has had a profound impact on my brain. I'm not in costume today. As you probably noticed, I don't have a costume for any of these characters. I'm sorry, I failed you. But I am wearing my cross earrings because this is a Christian book. This video is going to require a little bit of backstory, so that you can understand why this book has plagued my brain so much and why I decided to make this video as my second video on my channel. So we're gonna have to get into some lore about me. So I went to a Catholic high school. This was an incredibly small private school in rural Appalachia. And by small, I mean my graduating class had 11 students, including me. I don't think we ever had more than 100 students total when I was there. So this was like a super tiny school. And as such, we had maybe 10 teachers that just kind of taught every subject. And one of those was my religion teacher, because this was a Catholic school. She was a fascinating woman. We're going to call her Mrs. M. Mrs. M was a very enthusiastic and eccentric person. And allegedly, I have no way of confirming this might just have been rumors, but allegedly, she did not have the qualifications to teach high school. She had taught at an elementary school before this, and I can imagine her being a very good elementary school teacher. She was very just over the top and bubbly, but her teaching methods did not translate well to high schoolers. Our class consisted of a lot of rather childish activities. We would watch movies about morals and write journals about our feelings. And she would sing us songs about the Bible that were always set to the tune of the Brady Bunch. If there was lore behind that, I don't know what it was. She just loved that song for some reason. And one of the things that we did in her class was read a book. And she did not pass out books to us and have us read them. She sat in front of the class every day and read us a novel out loud with big dramatic gestures and emotional character voices. It was like a whole performance. It was so funny. I wish so much that I had a recording of it to prove that this really happened. But this was also probably the most insufferable way to present a book to a bunch of students who were old enough to drive. And all of this was awesome because, as I'm sure you know, teenagers love being talked down to and treated like they're tiny children. So we had a hell of a time in her class. It also meant that the first time I read this book, I was not reading it, I was having it read to me, which was a very strange experience. And this was her personal copy. So, she took it home with her. I never even got to, see it or, hold it. So, I started to question whether or not this book was even real. I started to wonder if this was just, her personal Bible fan fiction that she wrote and shared with us. And we never even had any, assignments about it or, discussions in class about it. I think it was just meant to be entertainment, which is weird. And especially weird because I hated this book. It made me so viscerally angry that I wrote an entire essay not even for class. I just wrote it in my free time, like after school. And obviously I never turned it in because like this essay was very mean and I swore. Uh, but I did at some point like include some of my points, like toned down, gentler version of some of the reasons that I didn't like the book in like some other homework assignment that we had. I think like one of my essays wasn't long enough, so I just threw in some thoughts about the book that we were reading as filler. And she got like mad about it. Like she gave like a speech to the whole classroom about like how we just didn't understand it and it's actually the best book ever, which is really weird under these circumstances. Like if I don't understand it, it's probably because you're not presenting it well enough. Maybe try reading a book about how to teach high school, I don't know. And she also never addressed like why we should like it or like what I didn't understand about it. She just made it very clear that I wasn't allowed to dislike this book, which made me like it even less. And because the circumstances of reading this book were like so bizarre and surreal, over the years I really just started to question whether this even really happened or if it was just like a mass hallucination that we all had. And if you had told me last year that like I had just like dreamed this, I honestly might have believed you because it's been 10 years. I didn't remember it very well. But I've been using the same Google Docs account since high school, and I still have that mean essay that I wrote. So I had proof that it was real, and I bought it. And we're gonna read it together today. So I went into this with two main questions. One, was it as bad as I remembered it? Or did my teacher's weird presentation of it just inspire like some visceral rage in me? And two, what was I supposed to learn reading this book? Because like my teacher never really told us what we were supposed to take away from this experience. Like it was never addressed, like what lesson we were supposed to learn here. So hopefully reading it on my own, I should be able to answer those two questions. So this book is called The 12th Prophecy. Nice close-up for you right there. This was written by two people, so when I refer to the authors, I'm going to refer to them as they, because it is like a pair of people. And let's start out by reading the little summary. She is a singer of sweet songs and a sinner. That last part is debatable, but we'll get into that. A searcher for truth and an outcast. Life is fraught with danger in the village of Sychar in 1st century AD. But for Abigail, the Samaritan woman, the danger lies not as much from the ever-present Roman soldiers, but from the rabbi and the people of Sychar. A woman of renowned beauty, whose reputation was tarnished at an early age, Abigail is pregnant, and the father is not her elderly husband Zacchaeus. While protecting her lover's name, believing he will spirit her away, Abigail is imprisoned and then nearly stoned by her neighbors. She's befriended by the beggar Leah, but even the beggars, the lowest of the low, don't want her around. Abigail longs for love, kindness, and a home for her soon-to-arrive baby, and forgiveness for her anguished soul. The answers will come from the most unlikely of places, unless you know that this is a Christian book, in which case you know it's Jesus. Also, I don't know why Leah gets mentioned by name in the summary. She's not in that much of the book. But anyway, let's get into this. So in the first chapter, we meet Abigail. She is in jail. She's about to be stoned to death, as the summary already told you. And while I was reading this part of the book, like the first chapter, I was actually surprised. I actually enjoyed it more than I thought I was going to. Like, it is pretty good. It's engaging and suspenseful, and the pacing is normal. So I was thinking that maybe this is actually an okay book, and it was just my teacher's bizarre reenactment and dramatic performance of it that was, like, so off-putting to me. But no. That's not it. The first chapter is by far the best one. I mentioned the pacing specifically because the rest of this book is so slow and boring. This is the only chapter that has, like, good, normal pacing that you would expect in a novel. It's like such a strong start that goes nowhere. Anyway, the townspeople are gonna kill Abigail because she cheated on her husband, who has been gone on, like, some business trip or something for like a year. So obviously he can't be the dad if he's been gone for a year. But she's not gonna tell them who the dad is because she knows that they'll try to kill him too, and she wants to protect him. Her husband formally divorces her in front of everyone. And we also learn in this scene that he's like 40 years older than her. But we don't know how old Abigail is, and they also never tell us how old Abigail is. So, like, I have no frame of reference for, like, how old this man is. He could be, like, 60 or he could be, like, 90. I don't know. So, anyway, she's, like, dragged out into the town square, and they, like, hit her a few times to try to get her to tell them the name of her lover. But then a Roman soldier named Romulus, which is the most Roman name I've ever heard, shows up and, like, just kind of shoos them all off. And, like, everybody just goes home and everything's over now. Like, they untie her and they just all leave. It's like a very sudden and bizarre de-escalation of what was happening in the previous scene. Alright, so a few things you need to know at this point. Zacchaeus was actually Abigail's 5th husband. The other 3, well, the first 3, died tragically, like, months into their marriages, and then the 4th one was an abusive drunk who just, like, left one night for no explained reason. And there was one paragraph establishing this, and then none of these men are ever mentioned again. So I guess none of them had that big of an impact on her life. This is also the only time we ever get a hint to how old Abigail is, because they say that her first marriage was only a handful of years ago. But, I don't know how old she was the first time she got married, and I also don't know how many a handful is. So, awesome backstory so far. I know it's like I'm there. Secondly, Abigail did not cheat on her husband. A strange man broke into her house and raped her. And then he spent the next several months coming to her home every night to, like, bother her and profess his love for her. And for some reason, instead of finding this, like, creepy and disturbing, she found it romantic and fell in love with him. So this stranger violently assaulted her and then spent months stalking her, and that made her fall in love with him. So this is awesome and not weird at all. So he told her that they were gonna, like, run away together and get married. But then, as soon as he found out that she was pregnant, he stopped coming around, and he didn't show up when she was about to be stoned to death, so presumably he has just abandoned her to die. And just for the sake of, like, establishing a timeline here, they never had consensual sex. She got pregnant from the rape. So, he raped her, and then he stopped coming around to her house when he found out that she was pregnant. So, this takes place over, like, 6 months or less, I think, is the takeaway that I'm getting from this. Just, like, keep that in mind moving forward. They have known each other less than a year. And we still don't know who he is, because Abigail is keeping that a secret even from the invisible audience. It's like a big reveal later on, so I won't spoil it for you. And just to reiterate all of this, Abigail is about to be put to death for a crime that she did not commit, and instead of telling anyone what happened, she is just willing to die to keep this man who raped her safe. But luckily, she is let go because, you know, that Roman soldier just kind of shooed everyone away. And then she just kind of, like, wanders around for a bit until she gets to the town's drinking well, which is called Jacob's Well, just like that fucking scary water pit of death that I reviewed in my first water rating list. And apparently this is where all the town's beggars hang out, like there's a homeless encampment there. and a nice old blind woman named Leah, like, takes her in and lets her spend the night in her little, like, hovel made of sticks and leaves and stuff. And the next couple chapters are really boring. Abigail wakes up the next morning and all of the other beggars are like, Leah, we're not vibing with her. She's gotta go. Sorry. So Abigail just kind of sadly wanders around town for a while. She goes to Zacchane's house, and obviously he doesn't want anything to do with her because he thinks that she cheated on him. And then she just kind of like stands around in an alleyway, like hiding and overhearing these other women gossip about her. And this is the moment where we begin to see the real theme of this story, which is that Abigail is really hot. And she's not just some ordinary hot girl. She's so beautiful that it's basically a curse. Every man who sees her immediately falls in love, and every woman who sees her is immediately overcome by jealousy and hatred. Apparently the women in this town are not even really upset about the adultery. They've always hated her because she's prettier than them, and they're worried that she's going to steal their husbands away. This aspect of the book is so exhausting, and it is so hard to read because of it. With like maybe 2 or 3 exceptions, every secondary character in this book gets like crammed into this dichotomy of like horny man and jealous woman. The only motivations for any of these characters are lust for Abigail and jealousy over Abigail, which is like such a weird thing to do and such a missed opportunity because this book has a lot of potentially interesting characters. Like there's people from all over the biblical Mediterranean, from like all these different cultures and backgrounds and religions, and they're just all crammed into this weird like jealous woman and horny man dichotomy, and it's so annoying. And I'll point out some choice passages about this, but just assume that it's happening constantly. Like, the authors are just constantly drilling it into the reader that, like, Abigail is so unbelievably gorgeous and everyone is obsessed with her. So that's what these women are gossiping about, that Abigail is just so effortlessly beautiful and seductive, and she's bewitching men and tempting them away from their wives. And they catch her overhearing them, and they, like, chase her away. And she ends up back at the well after wandering around some more, and even though all of the beggars told her to go away literally that morning, now they're all cool with her staying for some reason. They're just like, yeah, why not? You can sleep here. Fuck it. Chapter 3 opens with this passage to further establish just how amazingly beautiful Abigail is. All was well within the town. In the marketplace, commerce and cruelty rested. The hawking of fruit peddlers and the envious gossip of homely women was silent, smug, satisfied. Hatred for Abigail had worn them out. The wives of Sychar slept deeply beside husbands who did not reach for them. The flesh and blood of Sychar's menfolk, no longer disguised in the daylight cloak of self-righteousness, was consumed with flames of secret desire. Inner lightning flashed in drowsy male brains, revealing the beautiful image of Abigail. Rabbis, judges, and unhappy husbands murmured in their sleep, dreaming they were kissing the soft lips of the woman they had lately cursed and banished. Lust for Abigail's beauty had been forged into a determination to destroy what they could not possess. Who was the lucky man among them who had seduced Abigail's heart and lived out the fantasies of every man in Sychar? God. The next day, I think, the passage of time is very unclear in this book. Abigail overhears more women gossiping about her at the well as she's sleeping in, like, her little lean-to thing. And also talking about how Zacchane's dick doesn't work, which I don't know how the fuck they know that. But, oh my god, Abigail starts going into labor. What inconvenient timing. And remember that Roman soldier Romulus who just kind of told everyone to scram earlier? He just kind of appears out of nowhere and, like, shoos away all the women and then, like, picks Abigail up and puts her on his horse, and they ride off to an inn that's in another town for her to give birth. And this inn is owned by a guy named Weasel. I wonder if that's his real name. Like, is that on his birth certificate? Did his mom really just, like, fuck him up for life? So Romulus the Roman soldier heavily implies that Abigail is like his woman and that the baby is his, neither of which are true. He does not know her. He just met her in passing like 2 days ago. But he orders them to like go fetch a midwife, and then he just leaves enough money to pay her rent at the inn for a month, and then he just dips. So Abigail has the baby. It's a girl. She names her Deborah. And she lives at the inn for a month. We skip a month into the future, and the beginning of chapter 6 is my favorite passage in the whole book, and I think you will understand why. It was almost supper time. The clank of dishes and the aroma of roasting meat quickened Abigail's appetite. She had no money of her own to buy food. Romulus had left funds reserved for her care with Weasel. She descended the stairs with baby Deborah wrapped in a shawl. Long tables were set for a communal meal. Male guests turned to stare at Abigail as womenfolk scowled and cast venomous glances her way. Weasel's woman had been friendly as long as Abigail had been sick, pale, and desperate. But in the weeks since giving birth, the color had returned to Abigail's cheeks. She carried her head erect, and her breasts swelled with motherhood. Added allure to her statuesque and shapely figure. Abigail was tall and slender, towering over the local females with their broad, bitter faces perched on thick necks. Pendulous breasts and stumpy ankles made the local women seem almost a different species from Abigail. The low women who populated Weasel's establishment hated Abigail for the same reason the respectable housewives in the town did. She turned the heads of the men in the courtyard. She smiled, and the men leaned forward, hoping she would see them. The eyes of Weasel's Ethiopian wife narrowed like a panther's when Abigail passed. Weasel's wife does not have a name. She is only referred to as Weasel's wife. So, that's cool. I just love that passage so much. I love it so much that I like took a picture of it with my phone so that I could just like reread it whenever I'm sad. It's so funny, and it's so funny to imagine somebody like writing that with a straight face and not realizing how fucking ridiculous it is. Her breasts swelled with motherhood. Me when I'm breasting boobily. Anyway, so that night, Weasel tries to break into Abigail's room to have sex with her because his name is Weasel, and what did we expect this character to be? After he gives up and goes to bed, Abigail sneaks out and like runs away while everyone is asleep and goes back to her own town and just like wanders around some more, which is pretty much all Abigail seems to do at this point. But we finally get something interesting happening, because that night Abigail has a prophetic dream where an angel talks to her. Unfortunately, not Gabriel, some other angel. But in my initial draft of this script, I didn't even include this dream because it's like weirdly irrelevant to the plot. Like, this prophecy is not contingent on Abigail doing anything. The angel's not asking her to like complete a task or pass on a message. It's just like, some things are going to happen. Cool. So this isn't introduced to give Abigail any like bigger purpose or motivation. It's just kind of a thing that happens and is very inconsequential in the grand scheme of this book. But anyway, she goes back to her little lean-to at the well, and conveniently her rapist shows up to give her money. And this scene's really weird because, like, we're still not allowed to know who he is. Like, he's physically present and has dialogue, but we are not allowed to know his name or what he looks like. He's, like, shrouded in mystery the whole time. So right when her money runs out, there's this whole convoluted event where, like, this little messenger boy comes to her and, like, tells her to go to the pottery shop. but this kid cannot describe the man who gave him the message. Like, he doesn't know his name, he can't tell Abigail what he looks like. So, like, we're just meant to assume that this is Abigail's lover. So she goes to the Potter and she's like, hey, I got a weird message telling me to come here. And he's like, oh yeah, a mysterious man rented the room that I have out back, so as long as he keeps paying, you can stay here. And then we get one of the strangest pacing choices in any book that I have ever read. Okay, it's like, I'm not even really sure how to describe what happens in these upcoming scenes. Abigail is living at her new room at the Potter's house, and for like several days in a row goes into town to get like food or water or something. And while she's there, she is bullied and harassed by the women of Sychar, and like they chase her away, and she returns back to her room, and then new people show up there to harass her. And this happens for multiple consecutive scenes with nothing in between them. So it's like this weird, uncanny back-to-back deja vu type thing. Like, by the third time this happened, I was like, is this just the rest of the book? Like, did they run out of ideas? Is it just gonna be this for 100 more pages? It really makes me wonder if this book was, like, edited at all. 'Cause, like, how did this much repetition end up in the final draft? Especially because it seems like a very easy problem to fix. Like, either spread these scenes out over a longer period of time, or like, just reduce the number of scenes to like 1 or 2, and just like cram the important stuff in there, because most of this is not at all important to the plot. It's just filler. Like, it's just reestablishing stuff that we already know, which is that everybody hates her and wants her to leave town. Some highlights are that a bunch of drunk men try to break into her room to have sex with her, because of course they do. Her ex, Zicane, shows up to try to bribe her into revealing the name of her lover, and she says no, and then he vaguely threatens her. And Romulus shows back up out of nowhere to rescue her from a pack of angry wives. And that is an exact quote, by the way. A pack of wives. Like they're just rabid wild animals. And while reading these chapters, I started to realize that maybe there is so much repetition in this book because the authors just don't think that we will be able to retain any information, because when Zicane shows up, they tell us 3 times over the course of like a few pages that he is very rich, which they had already established at the beginning of this book. But I guess they don't expect us to be able to remember events that were so long ago. So when rich boy Zicane can't bribe Abigail, instead he goes to the town's rabbi and bribes him instead to try to help him run Abigail out of town. And during these scenes, we keep cutting to the point of view of the rabbi's 25-year-old son, who is obviously an adult but still lives with his dad and is treated like a child. His name is Saul, and when Zicane and his dad are like scheming about how to ruin Abigail's life, he keeps like nervously objecting and saying that like maybe we should be nice to her. So obviously he's Deborah's dad, right? Like, we all see that coming. It's not that much of a surprise. Okay, cool. Anyway, eventually Abigail gets kicked out of her room at the Potter's house because somebody paid more for it. It was Zicane, who I guess is now just renting an empty room, which seems like a bad use of his funds, but in case you forgot, he is very rich, so I guess it isn't that much of a big deal. So she does some more wandering around town and finally decides to confront Saul about what a little bitch he is. So you may not have a concept of how far into the book we are at this point. We are over 100 pages in, and Abigail has finally stopped aimlessly wandering around and decided to go talk to her boyfriend, which she could have done at any time, keep in mind. The only reason that they've dragged it out for so long is for like the benefit of the invisible audience on the other side of the fourth wall. So Abigail goes to Saul's house and asks him what his deal is and why he hasn't, made good on his promises to run away with her and get married. But as they're talking, Saul's dad bursts in and is like, My son will never be with a harlot like you. He's already engaged to another woman that we picked out for him. Begone, thought! And Abigail is devastated because Saul is the love of her life, for some reason. So Abigail roams around some more and ends up at another inn, which is owned by a couple named Ezra and Zippy. And unlike everyone else in this story, they are super nice and offer to let Abigail live there. And this is a good example of how little Abigail's prophetic dream influences the plot of this story, because like the angel alluded to the fact that somebody named Zipporah was going to help Abigail, but it's not like she sought out someone named Zipporah to ask for help. She just like wandered into this inn by coincidence, and Zippy just offered her a job and a place to live like out of the goodness of her heart. And then later in the conversation is like, by the way, my full name is Zipporah. And Abigail is like, oh, this must be what the angel meant. But like this seems like it would have happened whether Abigail knew about that or not. So like what does it really add to the story that she knew that she was going to meet this woman? Not a lot, really. Shortly after that, Abigail encounters Romulus again in town, and again he just kind of shows up to be like, sup? Which so far is all he really does in this story. He just shows up at convenient times to like rescue Abigail. But like we don't know anything about him yet. They have not done any like character development. We don't know why he keeps rescuing Abigail or why he like funded her month-long stay at the inn. Like that's a lot of money. I mean, we know his motives because every man in this book wants to hook up with Abigail. But like they're trying to bury the lead with him. He keeps being like very cryptic and mysterious, and Abigail even straight up asks him at one point like, hey, why do you keep helping me? I don't know you. And he's just like, wouldn't you like to know, weather boy? And then he leaves. And like I understand they're trying to set him up as like this mysterious white knight who comes in and sweeps Abigail off her feet and treats her well, but like they've done it to an extent where like I don't care that much about him because like I don't know anything about him other than his name and his job. Like he's just some dude that keeps showing up. There's also a line in this scene, Romulus whirled in his saddle, which obviously means he like spun around to look behind him, but for one beautiful moment I imagined him like spinning like a top. And then we skip 4 years into the future because why the fuck not? We find out that Saul married a woman named Mara, who, in a shocking twist, is an ugly, bitter, jealous woman who disgusts Saul and they hate each other. How do they come up with these characters? They also go out of their way to say that Mara wants a child, but hated the act that would make a child possible. So, she is canonically asexual, just like me. And if you thought that the villain of this story was going to be the man who raped and abandoned the protagonist, you would be wrong. It's Mara. Because of course it is. For the rest of the book, Mara is like talked up as though she's like just as bad or worse than Saul. But like we don't really see any evidence of it. Like she's just kind of generically grumpy. And she does one genuinely bad thing later in the story, which I'll talk about when we get there. But like none of the stuff she does is nearly on the same level as what Saul did. So like we're just expected to like take everybody's word for it that she sucks and she's the real bad guy of the story, but we're never really shown anything that would lead us to believe this. And Saul is physically present in a lot of the scenes with Mara, but like he has maybe 3 lines of dialogue for the rest of this book. He essentially becomes a non-character as soon as Mara is introduced. So after we've jumped 4 years into the future for some reason, we have like a chapter or 2 where Abigail and Deborah are like very happily living with Ezra and Zippy. They've kind of like adopted them and they're all like a big happy family. And then out of nowhere, Saul and Mara show up with a bunch of guards and steal Deborah. But the reason they're doing this is not because Saul is Deborah's dad, because that's still a secret. Nobody knows that they are related. The reason that they're doing this is because the town council decided that they don't want Deborah raised with a Jewish couple, because Ezra and Zippy are Jewish and Abigail and Deborah are Samaritan, which I guess wasn't a problem for the 4 years that they were living with them, but like now it's a big deal and they have to get her out and give her to some new parents. Like, it would make a lot more sense narratively if they had come to this conclusion before the 4-year time skip, but I guess they needed Deborah to be able to like talk and be unhappy about the situation for extra tragedy. And yeah, you heard that correctly. Even after Saul abandoned Abigail to die on the streets, she still hasn't told anyone what he did. Like, that's just a secret that she's taking to her grave, I guess. One really funny detail is the implication that, like, somebody involved in this plot hired, like, full-time bodyguards to just follow Mara and Saul around, because every time we see them for the rest of the book, they're like flanked by bodyguards like they're rock stars with an entourage. And seemingly the only purpose that these guards have is to keep Abigail away from them. Like, Abigail sees Deborah like across the town square and tries to run over to her, and the guards all like block her and like physically restrain her from getting too close to Deborah. So I think this is literally their full-time job. Like, someone's paying them to just follow this family around and keep this one woman away from them, which is kind of funny. Anyway, after they take Deborah, Abigail is so devastated that she, like, runs out of the inn and runs to a cliff and considers killing herself. And I have complicated feelings about this scene because I actually like it in isolation. Like the first chapter, it's very, like, well written. Like, it's doing what it's trying to do very well. And, like, it actually has an emotional impact. I think a lot of, like, the more emotional scenes in this book are just, like, so over the top that they're kind of, like, goofy and hard to take seriously. But, like, this one feels authentic, you know? But like I said, I have complicated feelings about it, and we'll talk about why a little bit later. So, obviously, she decides not to kill herself, because, like, she's the protagonist. She can't do that. And instead, she is going to try to get Deborah back. And she doesn't really know how else to do this, so she goes to her old friend Romulus to ask for his help. And he agrees, but he wants something in return. Now, we've all read books before. We all know that he is being set up as the love interest. He's the mysterious, handsome rescuer who keeps showing up to just whisk Abigail away whenever she's in a bad situation. So what do you think this man says to her? What does he want from her? Does he say, A, I want you to marry me so that I can give you and Deborah a good life and protect you and make sure that nothing like this ever happens again? Or does he say, B, I want you to come live with me as my personal sex slave, because if I legally own you, then I'll legally own Deborah too. And then she can also live with me as my slave. Vote now. I won't keep you in suspense. It's B. It's B. Oh, and before he says this, he grabs her and, like, forcibly makes out with her while she says no and, like, actively tries to pull away from him. I guess just to establish that he's also a piece of shit who doesn't give a shit about consent. And of course, Abigail agrees to become his sex slave because, like, what else is she supposed to do? This might be her only chance to ever see her daughter again. So she goes to live with him, and he's super creepy the whole time. He keeps saying stuff like, you know I've wanted you ever since I first laid eyes on you, and, like, this is news to me. Like, that's not at all the vibes that their interactions have had. They have had, like, no romantic tension at all. They just were very platonic. Like, this just, like, comes out of nowhere. I knew that it was coming because, like, I've read the book before, but the first time I read this, I was, like, so, like, baffled when this happened. I was like, where did this come from? And they've had 150 pages to set this relationship up. It's not like they ran out of time. Like, they just have been friends this whole time, and then all of a sudden he's like, I need to fuck you right now or I'll die. And it's like he just becomes a totally different character all of a sudden. I don't know why, but the first time I read this, I had it in my head that the reason Romulus was being so nice to Abigail is because he was like raised in a totally different part of the world with like a different culture and different values. So he kind of saw the whole tradition of like stoning adulterers and shunning people to be like kind of fucked up and unnecessary. And he was like going out of his way to help Abigail as like a moral point, like to openly say that he does not agree with the way that the townspeople are treating her. But I don't know why I thought that. I don't know why I expected any of these characters to have any more depth than like, oh, pretty girl, me want. But Abigail is like into it. Like, it really quickly goes from being like a master-slave relationship to acting like they're dating and they're like cuddling and bantering in bed. His mouth pressed against her lips, igniting a raging fire in her. Abigail, Abigail, can you love me? No, she teased, pleased that he wanted love from her at last. But are you happy with me? Romulus, she sighed, suddenly made tender by his vulnerability. Only in your arms, only then, I forget my life and I am happy. This is the night she moves in. They've had one conversation. And the next day she's all like giddy and in love and happy, and like this is why I don't like that suicide scene in Context. Cause like she got over that really fast. This is like one chapter later. Like yesterday she was gonna throw herself off a cliff in a fit of grief, and now she's just like, oh my god, I love my new boyfriend so much, he's so great. It just like, it kind of makes it gross and like trivializes it in a way that I really don't like. I mean, I don't like any of this, but I especially don't like that. And over the next couple chapters, she keeps like flip-flopping about how she feels about him. Like one minute she's like, I'm just doing this for my daughter, he could never love me, I'm just a thing he owns. But then the next she's like, oh my god, I wonder if he like likes me. Like, it's been a week. Can you like chill? Anyway, Zippy comes to see her at Romulus's palace, and they talk about a bunch of stuff, including an extensive conversation about how Mara is just like the most evil person in the world because she's like dragging Deborah around town and yelling at her. And like, I continue to not understand this at all. Like, they're talking about this like, first of all, it's just Mara. Like, Saul is not involved in this at all. And second of all, they're acting like Mara is like the devil incarnate for yelling at a kid, but like the main love interest of this story owns Abigail as a slave, and like that's not an issue. So like, I don't know where the line is for acceptable behavior in this setting. And the climax of all of this bullshit is when Abigail is at the drinking well and Mara and Saul and Deborah are like going by like across the ravine in a cart, and Deborah sees her mom and starts like screaming and trying to get to her, and Mara's trying to like hold her back, and Deborah starts screaming that she hates her, and Mara like slaps her across the face, and then Deborah gets free and jumps off the cliff and like plummets to her death. I mean, she doesn't die, but she seemingly plunges to her death. But Abigail climbs down and Deborah's alive. She's just knocked out and she won't wake up. And Mara is immediately just like, yeah, you know what, you can have her back, I don't really want her anymore. So that whole fucking plot point is just resolved immediately. And Saul is also there, not saying or doing anything. Like, he does not give a shit that his daughter just like almost died right in front of him, and that's never addressed. Like, it's never brought up that he just like doesn't care about her at all. Like, why did he go out of his way to take her if he doesn't care about her? And why did Mara want her? Like, I know that she wants kids, but why does she specifically want Abigail's kid? Like, Mara doesn't even know Abigail. They've never spoken before. She doesn't even know that, like, Abigail and Saul dated, because, like, that's still a secret. the implication is just that she, like, saw Deborah around town and was like, I want that one, and then, like, concocted this whole scheme to take her. As if that's a thing that anybody would ever do. But anyway, now Deborah's in a coma, and Abigail's depressed, but luckily Romulus comes up with a foolproof plan. He's like, just take her back to the inn where she was raised and sing to her, and she'll get better. And it works, for some reason. It's not really explained why, and, like, it takes a while, so, like, maybe Deborah just needed more time to, like, physically recover. But, like, she does what Romulus says and Deborah gets better, so now she's out of her coma and she's fine. And there's also a scene in the midst of all this where Abigail is at the well again, and, like, all the women who were mean to her are, like, being nice to her now, and Mara shows up and they're all, like, really mean to her and tell her to, like, fuck off. So now seemingly everybody is on Abigail's side. So, like, at this point, every plot point in the book has pretty much been resolved. Like, Abigail and Deborah are a happy family. All of the people who hated Abigail have, like, re-accepted her into society. Everybody has, like, formally condemned the villains. And Abigail even has a rich new boyfriend who knows how to cure head trauma for some reason. But for some reason the story isn't over yet, because throughout this whole book there has been, like, a B-plot about Jesus. It hasn't really been super important to any of the plot yet. Like, they're just kind of in the same geographical region as him, so, like, they've heard rumors about him, and Romulus sees him at one point when he's working. And then one day Abigail goes to the well and there's Jesus. And their conversation is just like a copy-paste of the discussion that Jesus has in the Bible with the Samaritan woman at the well. So that's who Abigail is supposed to be. She is a character inspired by that Bible passage. And their dialogue is super natural and not at all weird to read in the middle of a novel. And Abigail is suddenly overwhelmed by the love of God, and she runs into town and gathers everybody, and they all come to the well and hang out with Jesus and hold hands and sing Kumbaya, which I guess is a fine ending to the book. I don't know that it necessarily had a lot to do with the story, but, like, it was a Christian novel, so I think we all expected that at some point Jesus was gonna show up. And, like, it's a happy ending, you know, everybody comes together and they're all happy and enlightened and, you know, doing Jesus shit. Except Mara and Saul's dad. They were not invited to the Jesus party, so they're all going to hell. But that's not the end of the book. Buckle in. The next chapter is like an epilogue / like letter that another character is writing about how, like, after this, Abigail went on to become one of Jesus's besties, and she, like, traveled the world spreading sermons and enlightening people to Jesus's word. And she was this hugely influential and inspiring figure in early Christianity, which sounds like a much more interesting story than what I just read. She also married Romulus and they have 6 kids. Cool. But then, because she's an outspoken Christian in Roman times, they fucking kill her and her whole family. They behead Romulus and all of their kids, and then they throw Abigail in a hole to die. I'm not laughing because I think it's, like, funny that they died. It's just such an absurd thing to, like, throw in at the end of the book. In the epilogue, like, oh yeah, they were all murdered. It's not, like, important or anything. And then there's a second epilogue set in modern day where a character named Eben, or Eben, it's E-B-E-N, I've never seen this name before, but he's, like, translating this manuscript and talking to another character named Lorelei, and they're talking about the apocalypse, which is apparently, like, about to happen. So her story's told now. What will you do with it? The original. Sheman will carry it back to Jerusalem. Israel is the only safe place for such hidden treasures now. The translation must be published soon. Soon it will no longer be merely fireworks exploding over London, or Paris, or Washington, or New York and Los Angeles, Chicago, other places. I have seen the vision of what is coming, Lorelei. This is the last turning of the year. That is why there has been so much opposition to all true things. What the fuck is happening? And somehow that's still not the end. The last, 60 pages of this book are a study guide with, questions and, space to write your answers. One of the most baffling things about reading this book in class is that we never had any, homework or assignments about it. So to learn that there's a whole ass study guide built into this book, and my teacher just didn't use it. Jesus fucking Christ. Okay. Some of these questions are really great, too. We're gonna read a few of them together. Who and what are the women of Sakar gossiping about? What motivations, desires, and fears do you think are behind the gossip? Gee, I don't know, you were so subtle. Maybe it has something to do with their pendulous breasts and stumpy ankles. How would you respond if a harlot showed up at your door with a child? I would be confused. So there is some context behind this one that you need to know. When Abigail first goes to the well and meets Leah and all the other beggars, one of them is a man who is missing both of his legs, and he's kind of rude to her and doesn't really want her to stay. So that is the backstory for this question. Why would an outcast, the legless indignant, not welcome another outcast? God, can you imagine being such an outcast that not even the disableds want you around? The fucking horror. For Abigail. I don't even know what to say about that, honestly. So that's the study guide. I just wanted to share that gem with you. And we're still not done with the crazy plot twist, because if you flip to the very back of the book, you find out this is the 12th book in a series. There's 11 more of these. So maybe if I had read those, I would understand what the fuck is going on with Eben and his apocalypse shit, but quite frankly, I'm scared and I'm not sure I want to know. So do I think that this is the worst book? No, definitely not. In the grand scheme of books, it's not that bad. I just think it's a very weird book. And I'm sure you all picked up on this in the snippets that I've read to you. But this book has a very dramatic, emotional writing style, and I'm not totally sure how I feel about it. I don't know if I like it or not. I feel that some of it worked really well and was very effective in what it was trying to do, and I feel other parts were just a little bit too much. They could have dialed it back a notch and it would have been better. But, some books just have, no style at all, and they're just, boring to read. And, so I can appreciate the artistic merit of, having such an intense style throughout the whole book. Personally, I get, really self-conscious whenever I try to write, really emotional scenes, because I'm worried that it's going to be, too dramatic and too much. So honestly, I kind of admire these authors' dedication to just, not giving a fuck about that at all, and just, dialing it up to 10 for the entire book, just making the whole thing the most emotional, intense thing you've ever read. I could never do that, so kudos to them. And I'm not a historian, but the setting and the world and everything all feels very immersive and well researched, so if you're really into historical fiction, you might really enjoy this, but I still don't think it's a good book. My main two issues with this book are the pacing and the characters. I've already talked some about the pacing, but it is so bizarre. It genuinely feels like they wrote the first chapter and the last couple chapters first, and then everything else was just filler to stretch this to a novel-length story. Which is really bizarre, because the story was clearly only halfway over when they ended the book, because they needed 2 full epilogues to tell us what happened next. Why didn't you just cut out some of the filler, have her meet Jesus earlier in the story, and then actually show us her becoming this inspiring Christian girl boss? Wouldn't that be a much more interesting and meaningful story? But no, I guess it's a much better use of your runtime to like have 15 paragraphs about how beautiful Abigail is and have 4 consecutive scenes about her getting harassed by the mean housewives of Sakar. And reading the first and the last chapters, like, you can see the potential that this story has, which just makes it all the more frustrating when the authors seemingly just ignore that potential and just like do whatever the fuck they want instead. With a more dynamic cast of characters, I feel like this could have been a good book. And honestly, I don't really care for the most part how like likable or relatable characters are, because like that's really subjective. You know, what I like and relate to is going to be different than what other people like and relate to. I'm more interested in how like well written and interesting the characters are, and these characters are neither of those things. We're going to begin with Abigail, as I think we should. The first time I read this book, I hated Abigail so much. I could not fucking stand her. But looking back, I think I just hated my teacher's impression of her because, again, this story was being read to me by a very overenthusiastic middle-aged school teacher. Having reread it myself, I don't hate Abigail. I also don't really like Abigail. Like, I don't have any particularly strong feelings about her because, like, she's just not a very interesting character. I guess I feel bad for her, but that's only because, like, this whole book is engineered to make you feel bad for her. Like, it's just a story about a sad woman having tragic things happen to her. There's not a lot of room for, like, personal interpretation as to how you're supposed to feel. But I just don't feel like Abigail has a lot of, like, depth. Like, there's a line in the beginning from one of the women that are gossiping about her. All she's ever had is her looks. And not to agree with a character who's clearly supposed to be in the wrong, but like they're kind of right. Abigail's main character traits are that she's beautiful and she's a good mom. And she's sad a lot of the time because people are unfairly mean to her. I don't know what Abigail's goals as a character are, because she spends like this whole book just being like, where should I go? What should I do? Won't somebody help me and my baby? She's like just one small notch above being like a stereotypical damsel in distress, waiting for someone else to like come solve all her problems. And they do. Like, every action that she takes in this book is just asking somebody else to help her, and if they don't, then she's just like, oh, well, I guess I'm out of luck. Guess I'll die. Her entire motivation as a character is taking care of Deborah. And, like, that's nice. Like, it's good that she loves her daughter and wants to, like, keep her alive and well, but it just doesn't give her a lot to work with, like, narratively. It's also not a motive that, like, evolves at all with the story. Like, she's like this from the moment we meet her. In the very first scene, she's, like, affectionately talking to her belly and, like, vowing that she's going to protect her unborn baby even if they try to kill her. And then she just kind of stays like that for the rest of the book. She doesn't, like, start out kind of cynical and jaded about being impregnated by her rapist and then, like, come to love Deborah and become a good mom. She has just always been a good mom. She doesn't really have a character arc at all, even though they try to, like, trick us into thinking that she did at the end of the book. Abigail was sad and beautiful before Jesus came, alone, hoping for something to change even when there was no hope. Nothing has changed. Millions are like her. I see her face every time I step onto the street. The longing lives from generation to generation. Only Jesus can satisfy such thirst. And who was she after the story you translated? A willow planted beside a clear river. Graceful, sparkling eyes, quick wit, funny. She could make you laugh. Her laughter was like a brook. Till the very end of her life, her gaze could reach right into an aching heart and touch a soul. She had suffered at the hands of hypocrites, so she understood the suffering of women especially. That's cool. Like, I'm glad that she went on to, like, find inner peace and happiness and all that shit, but, like, I didn't get to see that. This happened after the story ended. And funny, she could make you laugh. Do you know what I would have given for this woman to say one funny thing at any point throughout this book? Like, we get to see the very beginning of that character growth when she meets Jesus at the end of the book, but, like, then the book ends, and we don't get to accompany her on this journey that she apparently went on. Her meeting with Jesus doesn't even really, like, offer a conclusion to the story or to anything about Abigail's character. Because, like, her relationship with God wasn't really called into question at any point throughout this story. She's a very religious person the whole time. She's even receiving, like, prophetic visions from angels and shit. So, like, I had no doubt in my mind that she was going to become Christian at the end of this. So it's not like she needed Jesus to, like, guide her back to God and show her the way. Like, she was always religious. She always believed in God and believed that, like, things would change for the better. The whole Jesus sequence feels less like a conclusion to this story and more like the inciting incident for the different, much better story that we hear about in the epilogue. And honestly, even if I had liked this book and, like, really connected with the characters, not having a character arc for your protagonist is unforgivable. Like, it just displays a fundamental lack of understanding of how to tell a story. I also noticed really early on that Abigail seems to have, like, no life experiences beyond the events of the book. Like, that one paragraph about her dead husbands is the only meaningful backstory that we ever learn about her. She says she's lived in Sakaar her whole life, but she seemingly has no connection to any of the other people there. Like, she doesn't have any friends or relatives or even, like, acquaintances. Like, her only relationships are the explicitly romantic ones. When she's trying to figure out, like, where to go and what to do in the beginning of the book, her only options seem to be Zacchain and Saul, and when they both reject her, like, that's it. She's out of people to ask. It feels like she was just, like, dropped into this world last month. And, like, once I noticed that, it was impossible to unnotice it. Like, I spent the whole book wondering why she doesn't have, like, any family or friends in this town where she's lived her whole life. And I would think that that would be, like, an interesting dynamic to explore in the context of this story. Like, she goes to a longtime friend or a cousin or something to ask for help and they reject her because, like, they don't want to be associated with her anymore. That would be, like, an interesting, meaningful conflict, but we don't get anything like that. Like, even if her whole family had died in some, like, tragic accident that she just didn't tell us about, she's been married 5 times. Like, doesn't she have in-laws? Adding to this sense of Abigail being kind of a blank slate is her complete lack of agency in this story. Everything that happens to her in this book is a result of other people's actions, not her own. And sure, like, a passive protagonist can be like a narrative tool, but Abigail is passive to the point of seeming like a bystander in her own life story. She's just perpetually a victim. She's just an innocent girl who keeps having bad things happen to her because of bad people. All of the conflicts in this story are being driven by other people's decisions. She didn't cheat on her husband, she was raped. She didn't choose to date Saul, he forced her into the relationship. She didn't divorce her husband to be with Saul, he divorced her. She didn't break up with Saul, he broke up with her. She didn't choose to date Romulus, again, he forced her into the relationship. She didn't give up Deborah or get her back. Deborah was stolen, and then Mara just was like, okay, you can have her back. She didn't even break up with any of her past husbands. They all, like, died tragically. Like, Abigail's not participating in any of this. It's just stuff that's happening to her. And like I said, her entire motivation is taking care of Deborah. She doesn't even really, like, care about her own well-being. And I think it's supposed to make us view her as, like, this noble, selfless woman because she's constantly saying stuff like, I don't need food because I'm hungry. I just need to eat so I can produce milk for my baby. And I don't need shelter for me. I would live on the streets without complaint, but I need a place to raise my baby. Won't somebody think of my innocent baby? But to me, that just makes her feel very apathetic. Like, what drove her before she got pregnant? You know? Because it doesn't seem like she has any sense of purpose beyond being a mother. Like, you get the sense that she wouldn't even bother staying alive if it weren't for Deborah. Like, if the townspeople had tried to kill her before she got pregnant, she would have just been like, whatever. And when I was reading some of those parts, I started to give this, like, the benefit of the doubt that, like, maybe this is on purpose because Abigail's meant to be, like, clinically depressed or something, and obviously that would make you, like, sad and apathetic and not really care about your own life, but, like, I don't think that's what's going on here, and if it is supposed to be what's going on, they didn't do a great job with it. Because whenever Abigail's circumstances improve, like when she's living with Ezra and Zippy, or when she starts dating Romulus, she's, like, very happy. She's not sad anymore. She's, like, bubbly and totally content with life. And, you know, if she had, like, a chemical imbalance in her brain that made her depressed, then, like, that wouldn't be the case. There would still be, like, lingering symptoms of mental illness. And if it is the intent to make Abigail clinically depressed, then I have new beef with this story for implying that becoming Christian cured her mental illness. So between those two options, I'd rather believe that she's just a badly written character. Based on, like, the description of the book, you get the feeling that Abigail is going to be this, like, morally gray character who needs to be, like, saved and redeemed by Jesus. But that's very much not the case. The authors go out of their way to make her unambiguously a victim the whole time. And in the study guide, they even say the townspeople believe that she has sinned, with sinned in quotes. Like, the authors are also admitting that she didn't do anything wrong. And if you really want a character who's, like, totally innocent and morally pure and blameless, like, that's fine. I mean, it's boring, but, like, this is your book. But why set it up like this is going to be a story about, like, a lustful woman tempted into a life of sin? The ending of the book really focuses on, like, forgiveness and the idea that Jesus can forgive all of your sins and wipe your past clean, but, like, what is Abigail being forgiven for? Like, she didn't do anything bad. She doesn't need to be redeemed because she didn't do anything wrong in the first place. I guess she gets, like, social redemption in the sense that, like, all of the townspeople go from hating her to, like, standing with her and taking her side against Mara, but that's not due to anything that Jesus or Abigail did. It's, like, pretty blatantly stated that the only reason people like her is because of Deborah. Like, Deborah's a cute, charming kid, and everybody likes Deborah, so they just have to like Abigail by proxy. And they all start hating Mara because she was mean to Deborah. So Abigail didn't even get to play a role in her own redemption arc. It was her 4-year-old daughter doing all of the legwork. And I think that's really emblematic of why Abigail doesn't work as a character, because she's, like, barely a character. Seemingly, her only redeeming quality is that she's a mother. And I'm sorry, that's not enough to justify her role as the main character of the story. And it's not like the other characters are adding much to the story. Abigail is by far the most interesting and nuanced one, and I mean, she's really boring, so let's get into the creepy, unlikable love interest, shall we? Saul is arguably the main love interest in the first half of the book, but, like, I'm not going to spend too much time on him because he is being set up as a villain and not somebody that Abigail is supposed to end up with. I just would have liked to know why she was in love with him and, like, why she was so deeply loyal to him to the point of risking her own life to save him. We never see them interact in any meaningful way. They have one scene together before they break up, and he's just like, here's some money, see you later, and it's very obvious that, like, he's not that into her. And I know they want to set him up as somebody that we're not supposed to like, but, like, they can do both. They can show us why Abigail loves him, while still showing us that he's a piece of shit who she shouldn't be with. Like, Abigail says that he, like, wrote her these beautiful love letters. Why can't we have a scene where she's reading one and, like, reminiscing about how special it made her feel? Because then we would understand her feelings while still knowing that, like, his words and his actions are not matching up. But instead, she just fell in love with him at some point before the story started, and by the time we meet her, their relationship is already pretty much over. So, like, we never learn what their dynamic was, or what qualities about him she liked, so we can't really empathize with her love for him at all. And you may have also noticed that Saul's actions and personality are just like all over the place and like borderline incomprehensible the whole time. In the beginning, he's set up as this like domineering alpha male who takes what he wants and doesn't take no for an answer. And he's also super romantic and madly in love with Abigail and would do anything to have her. But then we meet him and he's like this timid little man-child who's like, oh, sorry, we can't get married. My dad said no, and also I don't want kids. But then he goes out of his way to steal Deborah. Like, he's a part of this whole scheme to, like, take Deborah away from Abigail and raise her with his new wife. But, like, also, he's not really, like, bothered or anything if the kid, like, falls off a cliff and dies, you know, it's just whatever. Like, his traits and motives keep shifting, just depending on, like, what would be the most inconvenient to Abigail. I'm starting to think that, like, maybe he's just doing this for the thrill of it. Like, maybe he's just the Joker of the biblical Middle East. So overall, I don't know who the fuck Saul is or, like, what he wants, and I've read this book twice, so he's an awesome character. But let's move on to Romulus, who, quite frankly, is not really any less creepy than Saul. But he's the guy that Abigail ends up marrying and having a bunch of kids with. Even though, like, he violates her consent and he treats her like an object and literally owns her as a slave. It's especially gross because, like, he didn't need to make her his slave to be with her. Like, there was nothing stopping him from just, like, asking her out. It's not like this is a forbidden romance and, like, society would never let them be together. Like, he could have just been like, hey, you're pretty cool, you want to hang out sometime? But instead, he waited till she was in, like, a desperate situation and then used that to manipulate her into having sex with him, which is just really gross and creepy. And there's a good chance that she would have said yes if he had just asked her out under normal circumstances. Like, there's no indication that she's not into him. They have, like, a good rapport. And he keeps, like, rescuing her, so you'd think that she would be, like, at least grateful enough to, like, spend time with him socially at some point. He had the potential to be one of the more interesting and nuanced characters in this story if they had given him literally any motivation other than lust. Like, why did they backpedal? Do they only know how to write one kind of man? Like, is that just the initial template for all of their male characters? Just, like, this aggressively horny guy who goes around, like, assaulting women? And that 180 he does in the second half of the book also actively undermines his heroic role in the first part of the book. Because we learn that the only reason he did all that was because he thought that she was hot. Like, if he hadn't been attracted to her, he would have just been cool with letting the townspeople beat her to death. I'm just really disappointed in the way that the authors handled Romulus because, like, I feel like he could have been my favorite character if they hadn't just, like, made him super gross and creepy in the second half of the book. So to recap, Saul and Romulus, who are the two main love interests, are both men driven by lust who feel entitled to Abigail's body because they think she's pretty, and they go about this in the most selfish and predatory and manipulative way possible. And in that way, they're identical to every other man in this book, so I don't know what makes them more special or worthy of love in Abigail's eyes. Like, we see her reject other men for being creepy, but then she tolerates that same behavior from her love interests. And I understand that this was, like, the 1st century AD, and, like, obviously women were seen as lesser than men and were considered more like possessions than equals. But, like, there was never a point in history where every man was just like this unhinged beast driven by lust going around, like, assaulting every beautiful woman he laid eyes on. Like, people were still people in the past. They still had, like, their own personalities and interests and individual preferences. And while I'm on this subject, it's really fucked up how all the sexual assault in this book is treated. It's never really given, like, the emotional weight that you feel like it calls for because Abigail keeps falling in love with the guys who rape her. She falls in love with Romulus, like, the day that he enslaves her, and we don't really know what happens with Saul, but, like, she fell in love with him at some point after he raped her and before she realized that she was pregnant, so that could only be, like, a few months. it's never really examined on a deeper level how, like, traumatic those experiences would be. And neither of these characters ever receive, like, criticism or consequences for this behavior. Romulus is actually rewarded for this behavior because he ends up married to Abigail and then being, like, revered as a martyr thousands of years later. Saul's crimes are never found out by any of the townspeople because Abigail is committed to keeping that a secret forever. And he doesn't even face, like, the same social exclusion and criticism that Mara faces at the end of the book, because, like, she's fully blamed for what happened with Deborah. Saul is never, like, held accountable for also being involved in this. I guess Saul is punished in the sense that he, like, had to get married to, like, a fat, ugly woman, but, like, that's more of a punishment for Mara than anything, honestly. Violation of bodily consent just seems to be, like, written off as, like, a quirky little thing that men do sometimes, and it's not, like, a big deal, which seems unbelievably irresponsible in a Christian book designed to teach moral lessons. Especially because she ends up marrying Romulus, who literally owns her as a slave. Like, they are not in a relationship. She's his property. And, like, maybe that is how things were sometimes in the past, but, like, they wrote this book in 2011, and to a modern audience, it's incredibly weird that Abigail is, like, so charmed by these shitty men. And of course, we can't talk about the horrible men in the book without talking about the horrible women in the book. Because just like every man in this story is motivated by lust, every woman in this story is motivated by jealousy and hatred for Abigail. And the narration is, like, really fucking mean to them. It is just constantly reiterating that every woman in this world is, like, fat and ugly and disgusting and can't please their husbands sexually. The text at one point even repeatedly starts calling the women who hang out at the well warthogs. Like, that's not dialogue said by a character. That's just, like, in the text, like, refers to them as the warthogs. Like, the authors just decided to give them, like, a mean nickname. And apparently this is the driving reason behind why they hate Abigail. Not because she committed adultery, just because they're ugly and disgusting and she's a paragon of feminine beauty. Even when she's staying in a tavern in another town and nobody knows her, all of the other women just immediately dislike her out of jealousy. The women in this book are like a hive mind. Like, they're all basically the same character with, like, no nuance between them. They frequently don't even get names of their own. They're just referred to as, like, male character's wife. And all of this combined feels very misogynistic, to say the least. Especially coupled with how bland and uninteresting Abigail is. Like, it feels like the authors are really trying to make a point that physical beauty is the only trait that is important to a woman. And if you're beautiful on the outside, it's indicative of being a good person on the inside. So Abigail's beauty is meant to show us some deep moral quality of her character, and the other characters' ugliness are meant to make us hate them. The only two women in the story who aren't just jealous haters are Leah and Zippy. Leah is a kind, motherly figure who takes Abigail in her time of need, and Zippy is also a kind, motherly figure who takes Abigail in her time of need. Because I guess those are the only two kind of women that exist. There's moms and rivals. And the only other woman who is important to the story is, of course, Mara. And I don't think any other character epitomizes this misogynistic narrative better than Mara. She's bad because she's ugly and bitter and asexual and doesn't submit to her husband. Saul, who is set up to be the main antagonist, just, like, fully takes a back seat and is, like, overshadowed by Mara, who is apparently the evil mastermind behind everything, even though she wasn't introduced until the 4-year time skip halfway through the book. But, like, she never really manages to do anything that's, like, worthy of that villain title. Like, I'm not gonna pretend like she's blameless. Obviously she was abusive to a child. That's fucked up. But juxtaposed against the genuinely horrible shit that the other characters are doing, it seems bizarre to get this worked up over somebody, like, yelling at a kid. Like, Saul violently assaulted Abigail and then abandoned her to die. And the guy Abigail ends up marrying owns her as a slave and has literally murdered people. Like, I didn't get into that because, like, I don't fucking have time, but, like, he's a Roman soldier. He's crucified people. All Mara did was be kind of grouchy and a bad mom. And, like, clearly she realized that she was a bad mom because she willingly gave Deborah back to Abigail, which you'd think would indicate some positive character growth on her part, but the narration, again, portrays it like Mara's just doing this because she's evil and selfish and doesn't want to take care of Deborah. So, like, even when she makes an objectively good decision, she's still made out to be the bad guy. So, like, why is Mara presented as the epitome of all evil? Besides misogyny, that is. Because she's the narrative foil to Abigail. Abigail is beautiful and sexy and kind and submissive and devotes her life to being a good wife and mom, and Mara is the opposite. So she just is the villain, whether she earns that title or not. And I guess the authors just want us to, like, ignore the fact that they've set up that Saul, Mara's husband, is, like, a man who has a past of sexually abusing women, because, like, that's never brought up as a reason that Mara might be unhappy. Mara's bitterness is framed as, like, a moral failing on her part and not, like, you know, an extension of her circumstances. Like, it doesn't matter that she was, you know, married off to a rapist who openly hates her. She should be grateful because her life is so much easier than Abigail's. Like, this book is so, like, mean and dismissive to anybody who's, like, going through their own shit. There's even a scene at one point where Mara is, like, having a very public, like, meltdown, and she's, like, crying and wailing about how unhappy she is, and everybody around her is, like, rolling their eyes and scoffing, like, oh boy, I can't believe Mara's back on this bullshit. And Saul, like, very rudely and dismissively chastises her like he's talking to a child. He's just like, shut the fuck up and quit causing a scene. And everyone is like, oh, thank God Saul got his woman under control. That was really annoying. Like, am I on another fucking planet right now? And considering the framing of Abigail and Mara as, you know, a good woman versus a bad woman, this feels not awesome. Mara is crazy and unreasonable for publicly speaking about being unhappy, and Abigail spent this whole book protecting Saul at the cost of her own safety and well-being. Like, she spent years dealing with abuse and harassment from everybody in her town just to avoid tarnishing Saul's reputation. She's totally cool just, like, taking the blame for his actions and, like, ruining her own life in the process, and it's like a selfless act of love on her part. Like, oh, she's too good, she's too noble and pure-hearted to ever hurt him like that. Like, shut the fuck up. Maybe he deserves to face consequences, besides being married to an ugly woman. This book is so fucking stupid, man. And, like, maybe I'm reading too much into this, but I don't think I am. I don't think the authors, like, put these implications into the story by accident. And despite the fact that this book bills itself as being a story about forgiveness and redemption, Mara and Saul are both specifically excluded from that. Like, by name, it says that they were not welcome at the Jesus party, that they just never get to be saved. They just are gonna go to hell for being bad people. Coupled with the fact that we already went over how, like, Abigail was never a sinner to begin with. What is the takeaway from all of this? Like, what is the lesson they're trying to convey with this? That you can be redeemed as long as you didn't do anything bad in the first place? That, like, some people are actually just irredeemable and deserve to go to hell? That Jesus only saves good women like Abigail and not bad women like Mara? That's a really cool moral for your Christian redemption story. So, final thoughts. This was a really weird book. And it was an interesting trip down memory lane for me. It was kind of like the opposite of nostalgia. I was reading a book from my childhood, but I didn't like the book and I don't have fond memories attached to it. Will I be reading the other books in this series? I won't lie, I am kind of intrigued by the fact that there are other books in this series. I'm not going to be reading all 11 of them, like, I don't have the strength, but, like, I might review another one, because I'm curious, like, are they all like this? Or was this just, like, the underwhelming end to an otherwise good series? So I went into this with 2 questions, and I got an answer to one of them, which is that this book is actually quite strange and not very good, and it wasn't just my teacher's bizarre presentation of it that was off-putting to me. But I still don't understand why my teacher chose to read it to us in class. Like, the message and morals of this story are pretty muddled, and, like, they carry some pretty sinister implications if you think about them for too long. And apparently we were not allowed to talk about this or criticize the book in any way because, like, I did once and I got yelled at. It didn't matter if my points were, like, valid or not, or if I was criticizing it in, like, a correct way, because I just wasn't allowed to have an opinion that didn't match up with my teacher's. She really seemed to believe that Abigail was this, like, universally lovable and relatable character, and that this was some, like, super important, meaningful story, and apparently took offense if you didn't agree with that. And, like, she's allowed to have her opinion. I don't care if she, you know, sees some deeper meaning in this book that I didn't. Like, whatever. My issue is just that, like, what was the point of this, you know? Like, you can't just read a book to a classroom of kids and be like, you have to like this, you know? There should be, like, a lesson to it. There should be a reason that you're reading it, aside from just, like this thing because I like it, children. And maybe it's just because I'm a bad, bitter, asexual female like Mara. But, that pisses me off. Like, even to this day, I'm mad that a high school teacher was upset that I dared to talk about a book critically instead of just taking it at face value. So, maybe this video was just for me to finally live my childhood dream of being able to dissect this book because I wasn't allowed to the first time I read it. And I guess it's a good thing I decided to do it now because apparently the apocalypse is imminent and we're all doomed. See you in hell, shipmates.